She worked in his shadow for 6 years. 6 long years of scrubbing marble floors that cost more than her entire village back home, of preparing meals she could never afford to eat, of watching a man the world called generous while he counted every cent he owed her and found reasons not to pay. Her name was Grace Okafor, a 28-year-old woman from a small town in West Africa who came to America chasing the same dream millions before her had chased, the dream of something better, something more. But what she found instead was a nightmare dressed in designer suits and hidden behind the tall iron gates of a mansion that looked like paradise, but felt like a prison. And on a cold October night in 2019, Grace disappeared. No phone call, no goodbye. Just gone. The billionaire, Richard Hartwell, told police she had run away, probably back to her country, he said with a shrug that seemed almost rehearsed. But Grace had left something behind, something that would unravel the carefully constructed image of one of America's most respected businessmen and expose a truth so disturbing that it would spark protests, congressional hearings, and a nationwide conversation about the invisible workers we trust with our homes, but rarely see as human. This is that story. And I promise you, by the end, you'll never look at wealth and power the same way again. It started innocently enough, or at least that's how it appeared. Richard Hartwell was not just any billionaire. At 64 years old, he was a self-made real estate mogul whose face graced the covers of business magazines, whose name was etched on hospital wings and university libraries, whose handshake with presidents and celebrities made front-page news. He was the American dream personified, a man who had supposedly pulled himself up by his bootstraps from a middle-class family in Ohio to build an empire worth over $3 billion. His company, Hartwell Properties, owned commercial buildings in 12 states, luxury hotels in 5 countries, and residential complexes that housed tens of thousands of people. He was known for his sharp business sense, his philanthropic gestures, and his carefully crafted public persona as a man who cared about the little guy. Every year, his foundation donated millions to causes supporting immigrant communities, which made what happened next even more shocking. Richard lived in a sprawling estate in the countryside of Pennsylvania, about 40 miles outside Philadelphia. The property sat on 18 acres of meticulously landscaped grounds, complete with a tennis court, an indoor pool, a wine cellar that could rival any restaurant, and a garage housing 7 luxury vehicles. The main house alone was 32,000 square feet, with 12 bedrooms, 15 bathrooms, a library, a home theater, and more rooms than one man could ever need. It was a monument to success, a fortress of wealth. And it was there, in that fortress, that Grace Okafor spent most of her waking hours for 6 years. Grace had arrived in the United States in 2013 with a visitor visa that expired 6 months later. Like so many before her, she overstayed, not out of disrespect for the law, but out of desperation. Back home, her mother was sick with diabetes, her younger brother needed school fees, and her elderly father could barely work anymore. Grace was the eldest. The responsibility fell on her shoulders. She found work cleaning houses, babysitting, doing whatever she could under the table to send money home. It was hard, lonely work, made harder by the constant fear of deportation, but she endured because she had no choice. Then, in late 2013, through a friend of a friend, she heard about a position at the Hartwell estate, a live-in housekeeper. Good pay, they said. A kind employer. A chance at stability. Grace jumped at the opportunity. When she arrived for the interview, Richard himself greeted her at the door, which surprised her. She had expected to meet with a manager or a head of staff, but there he was, in casual slacks and a crisp white shirt, smiling warmly and shaking her hand. He asked her about her background, her family, her dreams. He seemed genuinely interested. He told her he admired immigrants, that his own grandparents had come from Europe with nothing and built a life here, and that he believed in giving people opportunities. Grace felt seen. She felt hopeful. He offered her the job on the spot. $800 a week, room and board included. She nearly cried with relief. The first few months were manageable. Grace cleaned, cooked, did laundry, and maintained the house. The work was exhausting, but she had done exhausting work before. Richard was polite, even friendly at times. He would ask her how she was doing, compliment her cooking, and occasionally give her an extra $20 bill as a tip. But slowly, things began to change. The schedule became more demanding. What started as 8-hour days stretched to 12, then 14, then sometimes 16. Richard would call her late at night to clean up after dinner parties or early in the morning to prepare breakfast for unexpected guests. There were no official days off. When Grace asked for a Sunday to attend church, Richard would sigh and say things like, "Well, I really need you here today, or maybe next week," though next week never came. The pay, which had seemed generous at first, started arriving late. 1 week became 2 weeks, then a month. When Grace gently brought it up, Richard would apologize, blame it on his accountant, promise it would be sorted out soon. But it never was. The promised $800 a week became $600, then $500, with Richard deducting costs for her room, her food, even the soap she used to clean. Grace kept a small notebook where she tracked what she was owed. By the end of the first year, the number had grown to over $11,000. She was too afraid to push harder. She needed this job. She needed the roof over her head, and Richard knew it. Then came the isolation. Richard started insisting that Grace not leave the property without permission. At first, he framed it as concern for her safety, saying the area wasn't safe for a woman alone, especially someone without documentation. Then it became more explicit. He took her identification documents, her passport, and the expired visa, claiming he needed them for tax purposes and would keep them in a safe place. Grace felt uneasy, but didn't know what to do. Without those documents, she couldn't go anywhere, couldn't prove who she was, couldn't even open a bank account. She was trapped. The other staff members, a part-time chef, a gardener, and a weekend cleaner, came and went. But Grace lived there. She slept in a small room on the 3rd floor, barely larger than a closet, with a single bed, a dresser, and a tiny window that overlooked the backwoods. At night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about her family back home, who believed she was living the American dream. She couldn't tell them the truth. She couldn't bear to break their hearts. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My mom said I can't reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove her wrong. By 2017, Grace's situation had worsened. Richard's behavior had become increasingly controlling and unpredictable. He would criticize her work over the smallest things, a spot on a mirror, a wrinkle in a tablecloth, and use it as justification to dock her pay further. He installed security cameras throughout the house, including one pointed at her bedroom door, claiming it was for security, but it felt like surveillance. Grace began to feel like she was being watched constantly. She started keeping her head down, speaking only when spoken to, trying to make herself invisible. But invisibility wasn't enough. Richard began making comments that made her deeply uncomfortable. He would linger too long in the doorway when she was cleaning a room, make remarks about her appearance, ask intrusive questions about her personal life. Grace learned to avoid being alone with him when possible, but in a house that size, with just the two of them most evenings, it was nearly impossible. She thought about running away, but where would she go? She had no money, no documents, no support system. If she left, Richard could report her to immigration authorities out of spite. She was stuck in a trap of her own desperation and his manipulation. Then something happened that changed everything. In the summer of 2018, while cleaning Richard's home office, Grace accidentally knocked over a stack of papers on his desk. As she hurriedly picked them up, one document caught her eye. It was a pay stub with her name on it. But the amount listed was $1,500 a week, nearly double what she had been receiving, even at the beginning. Her hands trembled as she read further. The document was submitted to Richard's accountant for tax purposes. He had been claiming her as a full-time employee, deducting her wages as a business expense, but pocketing most of the money himself. Grace's heart pounded. She quickly took a photo of the document with an old cell phone she had managed to keep hidden and tucked it away. Over the next few weeks, she began paying closer attention. She noticed more discrepancies, more documents that didn't add up, more signs that Richard was not just underpaying her, but actively defrauding the government while exploiting her labor. She started secretly photographing anything she could find: pay stubs, invoices, emails. She didn't know what she would do with the information, but she knew she needed proof. She needed evidence that this was happening. Because if she ever found the courage to leave, she wanted to make sure he couldn't lie his way out of it. One evening in early September 2019, Grace overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Richard was on the phone in his study, door slightly ajar. She was walking past with a laundry basket when she heard her name. She stopped, heart racing, and listened. Richard was speaking to someone, his tone casual, almost amused. He said something along the lines of, "Yeah, the housekeeper. She's undocumented, so she won't say anything. I can pay her whatever I want. She's got nowhere to go." He laughed. Grace felt sick. She realized in that moment that Richard saw her not as a person, not even as an employee, but as a tool, something to be used and discarded. That night, she lay in her small room and cried silently into her pillow. She thought about her mother, who had passed away 2 years earlier without Grace being able to go home for the funeral because she couldn't risk leaving the country. She thought about her brother, who had graduated from university thanks to the money she sent. She thought about her father, who still believed his daughter was living a good life in America, and she made a decision. She couldn't live like this anymore. She had to find a way out. Grace began planning her escape. She saved every cent she could, which wasn't much given how little Richard actually paid her. She researched immigrant advocacy organizations, legal aid services, anyone who might help her. She continued documenting everything, every conversation, every withheld paycheck, every threat Richard made. And then, in mid-October, Richard did something that accelerated her timeline. He told her he was going to move her out of her third-floor room and into a storage area in the basement. He claimed he needed the room for a guest, but Grace knew better. The basement was windowless, isolated, and had only one exit that led directly into the main house. It was another level of control, another way to keep her from leaving. Grace felt panic rising in her chest. She knew if she moved down there, she might never get out. So she decided she had to leave, and soon. She packed a small bag with her few belongings, the photos of her family, the documents she had photographed, and the little money she had saved. She waited for the right moment. That moment came on the night of October 23rd, 2019. Richard was hosting a dinner party for business associates. The house was full of people, catering staff, noise, distraction. Grace knew this was her chance. She had noticed that the security cameras in the kitchen had a blind spot near the back door, a small window of space where she wouldn't be seen. She waited until the party was in full swing, until Richard was occupied with his guests, and then she moved. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She slipped out the back door, into the cool night air, and ran. She didn't look back. She ran across the dark lawn, through the woods at the edge of the property, her breath coming in ragged gasps, branches scratching her arms and face. She ran until her legs gave out, and she collapsed behind a tree, sobbing with fear and relief. She had done it. She was out. But now came the hard part. She had nowhere to go, no plan beyond escaping. She spent that night hiding in the woods, cold and terrified, praying that Richard wouldn't come looking for her. The next morning, Richard called the police. He reported that his housekeeper had disappeared, likely run away. He told them. He seemed concerned, cooperative even. He showed the officers Grace's empty room, mentioned that she had been acting strange lately, suggested she might have gone back to her home country. The police took a report, but didn't seem overly concerned. A missing undocumented immigrant wasn't exactly a high priority. Richard thought that would be the end of it. He was wrong, because Grace had left something behind, something she had carefully hidden weeks earlier, in case she ever needed it. Behind a loose vent in the third-floor hallway, she had stashed a manila envelope. Inside were copies of all the documents she had photographed, the fraudulent pay stubs, the emails, the financial records, along with a handwritten letter detailing everything Richard had done to her. The wage theft, the threats, the confinement, the manipulation. And she had addressed the envelope to a local immigrant advocacy organization whose address she had memorized. She had planned for this. She had prepared for the possibility that she might not be able to speak for herself, so she made sure the evidence would speak for her. 3 days after Grace disappeared, a cleaning crew came to the house for a deep clean before Richard left for a business trip. One of the cleaners, a young woman named Sophia, noticed the vent cover was loose. Curious, she opened it and found the envelope. She didn't open it, but she saw the address and the words, "Urgent please deliver," written on the front in Grace's handwriting. Sophia, who was herself an immigrant and understood the fear that came with that status, decided to mail the envelope. She dropped it in a mailbox on her way home that evening. 5 days later, The envelope arrived at the offices of the Pennsylvania Immigrant Rights Coalition, a non-profit legal organization. An attorney named Lisa Chen opened it. As she read Grace's letter and examined the documents, her eyes widened. This wasn't just a labor dispute. This was systematic exploitation, fraud, and possible human trafficking. Lisa immediately contacted the authorities. Within hours, an investigation was launched. The local police, now taking the case seriously, returned to the Hartwell estate with a warrant. They interviewed the other staff members, examined financial records, and reviewed security footage. What they found confirmed everything in Grace's letter. Richard Hartwell had been exploiting Grace for years, withholding pay, confiscating her documents, and trapping her in a situation she couldn't escape. But there was still one question. Where was Grace? For 2 weeks, no one knew. The media picked up the story. Headlines screamed about the billionaire philanthropist accused of exploiting his housekeeper. Immigrant rights groups held rallies outside Richard's office building. Richard, for his part, maintained his innocence. He claimed Grace was lying, that she had stolen from him and run away, that he was the victim here. His lawyers worked overtime to paint him as a generous employer betrayed by an ungrateful employee. But the evidence was damning. The documents didn't lie. The testimonies from other staff members who had witnessed his behavior didn't lie. Public opinion turned against him quickly. And then, on November 7th, Grace was found. A small church in Cleveland, Ohio, had been sheltering her. The pastor, Father Miguel, had found her sleeping in the church doorway one morning, exhausted and terrified. She had hitchhiked and walked over 200 miles to get there, sleeping in bus stations and parks, too afraid to ask for help because she didn't know who might turn her in. Father Miguel and his congregation took her in, gave her food, a safe place to sleep, and eventually, when they learned about the investigation, they contacted the authorities. Grace was brought back to Pennsylvania, not as a fugitive, but as a witness. Lisa Chen and her team at the Immigrant Rights Coalition took on her case pro bono. They filed a civil lawsuit against Richard Hartwell for wage theft, fraud, false imprisonment, and emotional distress. The district attorney, under immense public pressure, also filed criminal charges. The case went to trial in the spring of 2020. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, activists, and people who had followed Grace's story. Grace herself took the stand, her voice shaking but steady, as she recounted 6 years of exploitation and fear. She spoke about the isolation, the manipulation, the constant terror of deportation. She spoke about the night she finally ran, about hiding in the woods, about walking for days with no idea where she was going. The jury listened in stunned silence. Richard's defense team tried to discredit her, painting her as a liar and a thief. But the evidence was overwhelming. The documents, the testimonies, the security footage showing Richard confiscating her identification, it all corroborated her story. And then came the final blow. Investigators had uncovered something even more disturbing. Grace wasn't the only one. Over the past 15 years, Richard had employed at least 7 other undocumented workers in similar conditions. Some had been paid even less than Grace. Some had been threatened more severely. 2 had simply disappeared, their whereabouts still unknown. Richard Hartwell's empire, it turned out, had been built in part on the backs of vulnerable people he had exploited and silenced. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. They found Richard Hartwell guilty on multiple counts, including fraud, labor trafficking, and false imprisonment. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay over $2 million in restitution to Grace and the other workers. His business reputation was destroyed. Hartwell Properties lost major contracts. Investors pulled out. The man who had once been celebrated as a self-made success story was now a symbol of corporate greed and exploitation. Grace, meanwhile, was granted a special visa for victims of trafficking, which put her on a path to legal residency. The Immigrant Rights Coalition helped her find safe housing, enroll in English classes, and eventually secure a job with fair pay and legal protections. She also became an advocate, speaking at conferences and to lawmakers about the invisible workforce of domestic workers who labor in private homes with little legal protection. Her story sparked national conversations about labor laws, immigration reform, and the exploitation of vulnerable workers. Bills were introduced in several states to strengthen protections for domestic workers. Grace's courage had not only freed her, but had also shone a light on an issue that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. Today, Grace lives in a small apartment in Philadelphia. She works as a community organizer, helping other immigrant workers know their rights and escape situations of exploitation. She has reconnected with her family back home and is saving money to visit them for the first time in over a decade. She still has nightmares sometimes about that house, about the feeling of being trapped. But she also has hope. She has her freedom. She has her voice. And she has the knowledge that she stood up to one of the most powerful men she had ever met and won. Richard Hartwell is currently serving his sentence in a federal facility. He has shown no remorse and continues to maintain that he did nothing wrong. But the evidence, the testimonies, and the lives he damaged tell a different story. Grace's story is a reminder that power and wealth do not give anyone the right to exploit another human being. It's a reminder that the people who work in our homes, who care for our children, who clean our offices, are not invisible. They are human beings with dreams, families, and rights. And when those rights are violated, when their voices are silenced, it's up to all of us to listen, to believe, and to act. So I want to ask you now, how does this story make you feel? Can you imagine what Grace went through, the fear, the isolation, the courage it took to finally run? And what about the fact that this isn't just one story, that there are likely thousands of people right now in similar situations, trapped and afraid to speak up? How do we, as a society, ensure that this never happens again? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the justice system did enough? Should Richard Hartwell have received a harsher sentence? What more can be done to protect vulnerable workers? Let's talk about it. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, please share it. Stories like Grace's need to be heard. They need to be told, because silence is what allows exploitation to continue. And as long as we keep talking, as long as we keep shining a light on these injustices, there is hope for change. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And most importantly, thank you for caring. My mom said I can't reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove her wrong. Stay tuned for more stories that matter. Stories that challenge us to be better, to do better. Because every person deserves dignity. Every person deserves justice. and every story deserves to be heard.